At the beginning of the American Civil War, Florida was home to just over 67,000 women, comprising an almost equal number of white women and African American slaves.
Most of the white women in Florida are of the cracker class. These are women who live in log cabins, who wear simple dresses, not big hoop skirts. These are women who do chores, who have a broom in one hand but a shotgun leaned up against the wall because they may have to protect their family. These are women who are very spirited, but not very well educated. And so we don't know much about them. They didn't leave a lot of letters or diaries for us to look at. But this is the majority of women in the state. They are frontier women.
But there were educated women in Florida, some living on plantations, and some married to professional men in cities and towns.
Those women we know a lot about because they wrote memoirs, they wrote letters and journals. But they are a tiny, tiny percentage of the white women in Florida. Florida is part of the Cotton Kingdom, and about 1/3 of all Florida families owned slaves. Slave women did what slave men did. You would find them in the fields plowing, picking cotton. And then on top of that, you would also find them cleaning houses, taking care of children, and cooking.
At the start of the war, most Floridians were sympathetic to the cause of the Confederacy.
There's so much excitement going on. There's bands playing and fireworks, and nobody thinks it's going to last very long. The first thing women do is they make battle flags because that's sort of the first rush of enthusiasm is for local companies. Every small group's got to have a different one. They also spend a lot of time making uniforms for troops. They form ladies' sewing circles, soldiers' friends societies. Sometimes these are collectively known as thimble brigades.
But as able-bodied young men and husbands left to fight in the North, patriotic fervor began to give way to a sense of impending struggle.
Wives and daughters and sisters soon found themselves running farms and small businesses all across the state because there was no one else to do it. They would have to work far harder than they ever had before. They would have to learn to deal with the shortages of essential staples that would soon be felt by every Southern household.
The letters written to the fighting men reveal changes in women's feelings as the war drags on.
Suddenly they weren't so enthusiastic. There had been big battles, there had been big casualties. And women beginning to see this isn't going to be an adventure or a lark, and saying, come home, come home. Even some officers' wives by the second year of the war were saying to their husbands, I don't want you to make major, I just want you to come home. Honor is satisfied, duty is done. Your country is here, it's with us, it's not at the front. I think it was very hard for them by the second and third year, as they saw coffins coming home, as they saw men coming home missing arms, missing legs. They really sort of had to hunker down in that middle part of the war, but often it was with that repeated begging for this thing to end.
Women would write letters to their loved ones in the Army begging them to come home. It has been argued by historians that one of the reasons the Confederacy failed is that the women on the home front voted not to support the effort.
The war came to northern Florida's soil with the Battle of Olustee, or Ocean Pond, in February 1864.
Confederate soldiers told stories about going through the little towns along the way to Olustee. They stopped in Madison for a day or two, and apparently everybody fell in love because Madison girls, they said, were the prettiest in the whole state. But then the troops collided. And of course, what you had was devastation and the awful mortality of the Civil War. On the way back, there were a lot of coffins on the train that had to be unloaded and buried in the small town. And a woman in Madison was looking at the coffins, and she saw a young boy. And she stood over it and she said, my son, who was this age, gave his life for Virginia. This Virginia boy has given his life for Florida. Let me kiss him for his mother. And she leaned in and kissed his brow and put flowers in the casket.
But even as Florida women in cities and towns were organizing events to raise money and bolster morale, life for women on small farms was becoming nearly unbearable as the Confederacy commandeered their much-needed supplies.
You had to give something like 1/10 of all your produce to the Army. So they're coming after your cows, your horses, your pigs, your molasses, your corn that you've got stored. I think when they went after their food, that was really maybe a turning point, especially for ordinary women who could not afford to give a barrel of flour to the Confederacy. I mean, that meant their family was going hungry. At that point, you start seeing more, especially in the middle of wars, you see more desertions.
Most of the folks who lived here lived on farms or maybe small communities, very isolated. So their lives were difficult to begin with. And wartime disruptions, wartime pressures made that life even more difficult. Certainly by 1864 and into 1865, there was a considerable number of folks on the home front who either had thrown in the towel or were ready to throw in the towel. It's one of the reasons that the war would end, frankly, as cleanly as it did. There was no large-scale guerrilla resistance movement in the South that went on for years. Women wouldn't have supported it.
When you think that Florida gave 15,000 men to the Confederate service, it only had 16,000 men that were in that right age category. So that's a huge proportion of men going into the service. About 1/3 of those men never came home, died during the war. Another 1/3 of those men came home with very serious injuries, missing arms, missing legs, blinded, traumatized, unable to work, would be of very little use to their families. What would that mean then for the women? Well, for a lot of women, it would mean that what they did during the war, they would have to do for the rest of their lives. They would never be able to stop working. They would never be able to stop managing the farm or the plantation that was left to them. They would have to continue, and they would have to think about life in a whole new way. It also meant a lot of women would never get married. Their sweethearts were gone. There would be a large cohort of old maids. It meant a lot of women, the family money was all gone. And for slave women, the end of the war meant something too. It meant, of course, freedom. Finally, it arrived. And the first thing they needed to do was reunite their families. Many families had been separated. And then job 2 was often to find a way to make some money and to get the children educated. So I think what we have to see at the end of the war is family comes first for everybody. Whether it's bringing dad home from the war or reuniting a family or figuring out how a family is going to live, how they're going to make money, family comes first. That's what the women of all stripes were all focused on.
Jacob's last letter was dated November the 1st. And by the time the next one came from the government, I'd already figured the worst. My babies won't sleep nights crying for their pop. I say he's in heaven, but it don't make it right, no how. Our colored folks runned off as soon as they heard they was free. Still don't understand it, we always was good to them, or always tried to be. I hitched up the mule and I learned myself to plow. But the rain, it won't come, so the cotton won't grow anyhow. If it would only rain, if it would only rain. There's nothing civil about war when it comes to the battle. Brothers kill brothers, and slaughtered like cattle. They say Jake was brave, he took 3 Yankees with him, but I think of their wives and I think of their children. If it would only